It is very good to be here on this day. Good morning.
Good morning.
It's very good for me to be back here among you on this day. Now, many of you may not remember it, but back in the summer of 1989, I was, to Eastminster United Church, the summer student assistant to the minister. I followed Ed around a lot. I delivered the link. I did a lot of different things. And among the many things I did 3 sermons. You know, I think I should say a thank you because I think it was you actually, Peter, who called me and hired me that summer. You beat the guy from Inco's Mine in Sudbury by about 20 minutes, and here I was. It was a time of deep transformation for me, and you may not really be aware of that. I found a few things that have been foundational in my life of ministry here, although here was actually over there and in the McDowell Chapel at that time. The first thing I found was a love for preaching, doing just this. I found a passion that has stood me well in all kinds of different places, in all the churches I have worked in, from northern Saskatchewan to various parts of the Bay of Quinte Conference. I found that passion, and I found that, people didn't get up and leave when I got up and spoke. It's a good sign. And it's been a privilege and a joy in my life ever since, even though I don't do it as often in this work as I used to. I guess the second thing you gave me had to do with that process that you were under there that probably fills up your memories. You see, I arrived about 2 weeks after the decision to build this building and lived through that summer of all the decision-making within this congregation. And in that period, I watched a congregation that was in many ways divided by the making of that decision, divided over the shape and dimension of various different rooms in this place, divided over the paint color in the youth room, or in fact, the tone in the bricks or the hangings or the lights, and all of those things were hard decisions, and there were people on both sides of them, and what you taught me in that journey through that experience was a wonder and a love for the processes of the United Church. Because, of course, I had been of the opinion until that time that the way to get work done was to appoint a strong leader, not to give anything to a committee. If you want to get work done, you find somebody to do it. But you showed me the wisdom of a people gathered together about a common cause. You showed me the pattern of being able to leave behind the things that divided you, that could divide you, and to focus ahead on the life of this church, and to build this place, and to pay for this place for all the time in between. It was interesting that summer. We worked out of the church office that was in a house that was somewhere out about where the front doors is, that moved at the end of the summer as the foundations were laid. It was the pattern of the church in those years that whenever the church staff took holidays, we filled in with volunteers. Volunteer secretaries were present in that office for part of that summer as Eleanor took a holiday. And I think it was Ed who commented on the fact that the number of volunteers that year had gone from 2 to 12. And they all seemed to arrive in the office with a picture of their unmarried daughter and set it firmly in the middle of that desk. There was a real pattern, and I guess it worked. Pat, I think you were one of them. And of course, right there and in that summer, I found the love of my life. A woman who has followed me in all sorts of crazy places, in all sorts of crazy ways, And this May we'll celebrate 25 years since one of the very first weddings that took place in this room. My memories of that day are sort of filled with 5-year-olds and balloons. Brenda was at the time a kindergarten teacher and invited both of her classes to the wedding. We had this part of the church filled with family and friends, and 2 classes of kindergartens with balloons were in the balcony. That sense of joy is still there for us, and I give thanks for that regularly. Of course, our scripture today is really filled with things about the relationship that we have with God. It's there so strongly in the words of the psalm. That sense of a God that knows us completely, inside and out, deep into our hearts and minds, and loves us anyway. It kind of amazes me that a God can know us that well and still love us anyway. But I think that is hard at work in the scriptures around the call of the disciples. That call that is strong and powerful in our lives, that has been lived out in the creation of this church, in the calling together of a people of God here and now, was strongly at work in Jesus' presence. As he met with those 2 disciples, a simple decision for the first of them. He saw something in Jesus that responded to something in him, and that was that. Of course, Nathanael needed to know a little more. And Jesus demonstrated clearly there and then this understanding of God's that is complete, and called him into a lifetime of something radically different. I think all of us know a little bit about that call that Jesus is still working in our lives today. For we have been called together to be a church here and now. And there are some things that we can agree upon as we think about that call and about the living out of it in a world that is incredibly complex, incredibly amazing, incredibly wonderful, and yet challenging at the same time. I think we can agree, because we're gathered here, that God is powerfully at work in us, in this community, calling us together. That something bigger is at work here and now. I think we can agree that we too are known at that deeper level and loved. Of course, that's the message of Jesus. And called to respond in a particular pattern. It is the pattern that caught my mind when I came across the images of slime mold last week. Now, I'm pretty sure that in a lot of things you are smarter, indeed, than both the fifth grader and the slime mold. But the particular mold I'm talking about, Phaserum polycarum, it's a yellow mold that you can find on dead logs in deciduous forest. It's a one-celled organism that is changing the way that I think we think as a people about intelligence. Because without a brain, with only one cell, it is capable of amazing things that look a lot like intelligence. Anyway, this mold, a Japanese scientist has found, if you chop it up and spread it throughout a maze, it will grow back together. will connect up all the pieces and become whole again. It's kind of amazing when you think about how hard that can be for us at times. So there it is, grown back together, and you leave it alone for another 3 or 4 hours, and it grows out to fill the entire maze. It's mold. That's what it does. But then the amazing thing happens. If you put food at one end for it in the form of chips of bark or wood, and food at the other end, it will grow only on the best path between those two parts of food. It will, in fact, abandon passageways that lead to dead ends. It will pull itself back from those places and leave behind it there the slime that it's famous for. Now, that slime operates as a bit of a memory. It's an external memory that means to the mold that it need not expend energy in those unfruitful ways and can carry on. This mold is amazing in a lot of ways. In fact, if you place that food on a map where our major cities are, it will grow in a pattern that looks almost exactly like our roadways or railways, direct connections between those cities. I'm not sure I'm really ready to tell my brother-in-law Andy that his life as a traffic engineer can be replaced by a slime mold. But does that not amaze? Something as simple as a one-celled organism can gather together and work together to do far more than one might expect. I think it's that way with the church. When we gather together and find our focus, we are capable of anything. I think in the church we need to find our way through these times that are complex and the controversies that do not, for us, produce fruit. We can be a people. We can find our strength in the committees, in the decision-making bodies of this place. And we can find our future. But I guess this is where I have to connect back to this particular crazy kind of ministry that I do these days. Over the last couple of years, I have become and am today a conference personnel minister. My particular job is about pastoral care, caring for ministers. It is one of the jobs that is almost unique. London Conference has recently hired someone in a similar role, but the Bay of Quinte was years ahead in providing someone to spend time and caring for all of those in ministry, both active and retired. And it might surprise you that with 178 pastoral charges across the conference, we actually have 440 ministers, active and retired. Of course, that's a huge number of retirees that do take a great deal of my time. As a conference personnel minister, I represent the wider church. The part of the church that exists to support local ministries. And in my case particularly, it's all about those ministers. I communicate the manual, that grand agreement by which our ancestors came into being as the United Church of Canada. It's an amazing document. Something that has guided us and enabled us to jump through the generations to this day. I've said at times my job feels a little bit like living in a blender. It's a nice, comfortable space, lots of windows all around me, beautiful, shiny place to sit right there on the blade, and everything's wonderful and comfortable, and then somebody comes along and pushes the button. And everything's flying everywhere. all kinds of variety and challenge. But in the midst of it, I get to be present in incredible holy moments with a lot of our clergy. Some of them are about deep struggles. Some of them are about big decisions. Some of them are about beginnings and endings. It is good work. And that God that knows us through and through is at work in it, in all of those decisions. But I have to admit, today I'm feeling a little like a policeman out there on the side of the highway pulling over speeders. You know, I don't think anybody likes to see them much. I know, you're all far better than that. You've never gotten a speeding ticket and you haven't got a clue what I'm talking about, right? But none of us like that experience ever. We don't like to be called. We don't like to be caught. And yet, so at some point in that experience, we come to the understanding that this is all about safety. I'll admit, sometimes I like to see the guy that's just blown by me at 100 kilometers faster than me get pulled over. You know, that time when we're all thinking, well, it's good we saw that. So I feel a little bit like that sometimes when I come to a place like this and bring along a policy. In this case, I'm particularly sure that there have been those here who have hoped that this policy could be ignored. And the simple reality is, it can't be. And I'm here because of that. This is not a new policy. In fact, I've presented it to the clergy of this church more than once in the last 2 years that I've been on this job. It is part of a push that is going on for the last number of years on clergy ethics. And it is in harmony with the ethical standards for ministry personnel. It's a document that's come out in 2010 and adds some ground rules for those of us in the clergy. So the policy reads, and it is available after the service for you to take with you. It is the policy of the Bay of Quinte Conference that those who have disengaged from pastoral relationships must not be active within the life and activities of the pastoral charge from which they have disengaged for a period of at least 1 year. It is hoped that this period will help to facilitate a healthy new pastoral relationship in that place. And to ensure that the spirit of this new relationship between those outside of the pastoral relationship and the pastoral charges that they have served, that is mandated in the manual, becomes fact. This is not a policy that applies simply to those who retire. This is a policy that applies to every single United Church minister in the Bay of Quinte Conference. It does outline the relationship that exists between myself and the pastoral charge I left 2 years ago. The manual supports it, both in speaking of the functions of ministry outside of pastoral relationships. That's manual section I 2.5.3, but it's on the paper. You'll see it. At any time that ministry personnel are not settled in or appointed to a pastoral charge, they may carry out the functions of ministry in the United Church only if A, they have a formal association with the pastoral charge and are acting on behalf of the pastoral charge and have the approval of the charge's governing body, or B, they've been appointed to a United Church ministry or presbytery recognized ministry, folks like me. Section I 2.5.4 is that relationship that is spoken of earlier. If a ministry personnel is asked by a member or an adherent or their family members of a pastoral charge where they have previously been settled or appointed to preside at a baptism, communion service, wedding, or funeral, the ministry personnel must, A, refer to the request to the member of the order of ministry who is settled or appointed to that pastoral charge, and B, may only preside with the approval of that pastoral charge's governing body. Now, those are the policies of the Bay of Quinte Conference, and it's there to serve, as I said already, the greater church, the smaller church, the church that is in our congregations. It is good for all of those involved. I know it's hard. It's not easy. You see, the policy provides some necessary distance and clarity and an ability to move on, both for churches and for ministers. Now, I think ministers involved have a great deal of work to do when they've left a pastoral charge, and particularly when that comes to a retirement. I think all of you that have retired know a bit about some part of that work, and it has to do with the work that is about reimagining oneself without work at the center of it. For ministers, there is, in addition, a long history that has taken up a great deal of their lives. I have at times in my ministry done as many as 65 funerals in a year. Most years it's been, 40 or 50. And I can tell you from my own experience that that is a process that marks us. That we need to find a way to deal with grief. Not just the grief of aging and losing work, but that grief that is building. And this year apart is about providing a space to sort through identity, to sort through possibilities, and to find some healing and strengthening for the part of the minister who's left. Now, the congregation also needs to go through a process that I have seen from the perspective of one who's left a pastoral charge in a couple places now. When I'm at work in a pastoral charge, there are a lot of things that go on, a lot of programs, a lot of possibilities, all kinds of things happen. Some of them happen because I want them to. I work with good United Church people who will do what I want, sometimes. Most of the time, those are the kind of programs that slowly fall away once I've gone. Because, of course, the church has moved on. Now, if I'm sitting in the middle of it, it gets harder for the church to make those decisions. If I'm there sitting in the front row, it is very hard for a congregation to say, well, maybe that part of the ministry was you rather than us. And we want to do some of the things that are deeply about us, and maybe even explore some of the things that are deeply about the new minister who's in that place, and their particular pattern of skills and gifts and abilities. It is about legacy and sorting that out. And that work is not easy. I know it. Of course, the minister who stays in this policy finds confidence that the ground is cleared and prepared for their new ministry. Now, this is not about all the work of a church. Many of the things that you have done for years are bedrock and part of your pattern and will continue. Of course. Some of the things may not, and there will be new things, and that is being the church. Was the pattern that was happening here in 1989. It is the pattern that will be happening here in 2029, or any date that you might figure in the future. These policies exist for that purpose. Now, I want to conclude with a final story that I think it takes us back to that shattered mold in a maze, and to that process of pulling together around the things that we need to do as a church. I'm going to talk boxing for a minute or two. And remember C.D. Blalock of Louisiana State University. He was a boxer in the 30s and went by the nickname of Big Boy. You see, he was a 6'6" giant and a powerful man with a devastating roundhouse swing. And he had the fight of his life against a boxer from Mississippi State. But it seemed like a mismatch because Big Boy was taking on a much shorter, stockier fellow, a lighter man. In the second round, Big Boy let loose with one of those great roundhouse punches. And the Mississippi boxer stepped in and his head caught Big Boy's arm just inside the elbow. And with the opponent's head acting as a lever, Big Boy's arm whipped around in a almost full circle, connecting with destructive force on his very own chin. He staggered 3 more steps across the ring and fell down for the count. Big Boy's claim to fame after that was he's the only boxer in history to have successfully knocked himself out and ended the fight. Of course, I think we know how that works in our own lives. I think we know the times that our emotion, that the things that we don't really want to do but need to do, can act like that in our lives. And our responses can be like that knockout punch. So there are 2 patterns I've talked about today in the life of a church, that coming together that I would commend you to around the plan that you are forming for the future of this church, around the continuation of the great work that has been done here, and the new way forward that is possible. I know it's never easy when change happens, but ministers do come and go. And churches go on forever. I've had the privilege of worshiping in churches that were almost brand new and ones that had been there for 200 years. This work that you're about is part of the work of living in the church. And don't think that you are alone in it. This is a process that goes on in all kinds of places. I would conclude with a prayer. Loving God, this day we give you thanks. We give you thanks for all the powerful things that are at work in the life of this community of faith. We give you thanks for programs that feed the hungry and guide the community and build us up as individuals for the ongoing work that is ours. Guide us in this thing by your Spirit, that we might find our way to that difficult task that is about living as a church and supporting all that is important for the way forward, even as we find ways to honor our past. Guide us, gracious Lord, that we might find appropriate ways for all of these things, even the discussion that we will have shortly over coffee.